creation. Four foundational distinctives of a Christian view of reality. So in the book I've got a chapter on the Trinity that precedes the chapter on creation. I'm trying to sort of fold them into each other a little bit in this presentation and condense them down. And this is really the... in Australia we build houses on slabs. It's just a big bit of concrete. I don't know if that's the language that's used here or not, but this is the slab. This is the foundation that everything else is built on. You know, this is setting up the coordinates that the rest of reality is plotted in terms of here now. And what I want to draw attention to is four of the most important aspects of this slab, of this foundation for a biblical way of looking at everything and engaging with reality. And as a prolegomena to that, we've got to realise, of course, as we all know, that the God of the Bible is not some sort of generic God, not some empty idea of God. The idea of God in the Bible is filled with content. It's a very specific sort of God. Indeed, has a specific name and relates personally to his people. And so what we're seeking is not some sort of general theistic foundation, but what is the God of the Bible like? The God who, so to speak, walks off the pages of the Bible. What can we know about reality in a foundational sort of way from this particular sort of God? And I guess one of the first things that becomes really clear to us as we read the Bible, and this is an idea that's been really powerfully articulated by John Frame and others, is that ultimate reality for us Christians is personal, in the sense that the deepest reality that there is, you know, back of all creation, more fundamental than anything in creation, when we dig down to the bedrock of reality, that deeper than which and more fundamental than which there is nothing, what does our spade hit? Well, it hits God, and God is personal. God's not a force. God's not an equation. God's not an abstract idea. God is a personal God who relates to people personally. And so ultimate reality for Christians is personal. And that changes the game in very, very significant ways. And so the way that John Frame puts it is either everything that is personal in our world ultimately reduces to the impersonal, or, for the Christian, everything that is impersonal ultimately reduces to the personal, because God is behind and sustains everything, and he is personal. And that, of course, gives a completely different frame to the reality and dignity of persons in our universe. So if everything personal ultimately reduces to the impersonal, and if we as persons, you and me and your parents and your friends and your family, are basically just froth on the soup of life. It's sort of a wave that's cascading and crashes and disappears. You know, it might be around for a couple of million years, who knows, but we're not going to last for long, and then we're going to return to the impersonal where we were always before. If that's your universe, you and I are very, very different sorts of beings to if the ultimate destiny of the whole universe, as Ephesians and Colossians tell us very clearly, is to be brought under Christ, the person of Christ. Everything will be reconciled to a person. And if the one who created the universe himself is personal, is a him rather than an it, so to speak, that's a very, very different universe to be in. And you and I are very, very different sorts of people in that universe. And so already we've got a fundamental parting of the ways between a universe in which everything is fundamentally reducible to the impersonal, which I think the more we think about it, and the more that philosophers have thought about it, is actually quite a cold universe to live in. And Bertrand Russell was particularly good on this. Now, he sort of smuggled in an idea of nuclear disarmament in a weird sort of, never mind that we're all going to sort of be reduced to nothing anyway, let's try and get rid of all the nuclear weapons, because that's going to help. So there's a bit of weirdness to his position, but he sort of has these passages, doesn't he, where, you know, he says we've got to face the icy cold reality, that, you know, we're nothing more than whatever it is, a collocation of atoms, and that, you know, to the extent that we let that really, really sink in and not be just an idea, but not, I do see myself, that's rough, I think it would be fair to say, for almost all human beings. That's not a nice universe to live in. And on the other side, a universe in which human persons have inestimable dignity because we are part of the universe made by the personal God, and God himself is personal. Therefore, personality is not some sort of weird effervescence in the universe, but there is something lovely and stable and profound and delightful and real, I guess is the word I'm looking for, something real about it, because God is personal. C.S. Lewis in Miracles, unless the origin of all other things were itself concrete and individual, nothing else could be so. For there is no conceivable means whereby what is abstract or general could itself produce concrete reality. Bookkeeping, really contemporary illustration there, bookkeeping continued to all eternity could never produce one farthing. Hang in there. So the idea is that the form of something can never itself generate content. Metre of itself could never produce a poem. Bookkeeping needs something else, namely real money to put it in the account. And metre needs something else, real words fed into it by a poet, before any income or any poem can exist. If anything is to exist at all, then the original thing, capital O-T, must be not a principle or a generality, not an equation or a force, much less an ideal or a value, but an utterly concrete fact. And he's getting at part of what it means for the Christian. He's not capturing it all, but part of what it means, that we are the product of a personal God. And for philosophers in the room, this is the problem of individuation. The problem of how you individuate things within the flux of reality is an issue for philosophers. And this is the Christian answer to that particular philosophical conundrum. But ultimate reality is not simply personal. It's already wonderful that it is, but not simply personal for the Christian. Ultimate reality is also absolute, in the sense that God is not contingent upon the universe he's created. The universe is contingent upon God. We rely upon God. You know, Hebrews 1, he upholds everything moment by the word of his power. If he doesn't want us to exist, we don't exist. Like, we are contingent. But his being is not like that. He's not dependent on anything else. He exists eternally and self-sufficiently. He didn't need to create a universe in order to be who he is, for example. His being is of a completely different sort. He's absolute. He's outside the to and fro, the rough and tumble of creation. And the way that Frame takes this is that some cultures sort of grasp the importance of having an absolute God. So Aristotle, you know, will talk of his prime mover and so forth, and have it as some sort of absolute principle. And some cultures grasp the importance of having a personal deity. And so, you know, you get the Greek pantheon with the gods who are just basically like you and me, but with bigger muscles and bigger egos. And they go about, you know, shaming each other and fighting each other and exploiting humans and doing all the stuff that we do, but just on a bigger scale. And that the wonder of the Christian God, says Frame, is that he is both personal and absolute. He calls it absolute personality theism. And not in a way that's in conflict with each other. It's not that, you know, God's personality is a bit awkward in terms of his absoluteness. It's that there's a beautiful harmony between these two. And that opens the door to understanding our world in really profound ways, I think. It's what theologians, as you will know, I'm sure, have called the creator-creature distinction. There are two ways of being. There's God's way of being and the way of being of everything that's created. Two separate ways of being in reality. God's way and the way of everything else. And everything else is contingent and finite and reliant on him, and he is absolute and ultimate and not reliant on anything else. Cornelius Van Til, who wrote a lot on this, has this as part of his one of his central books, Defense of the Faith. I point out that the Bible does contain a theory of reality, he says, and this reality is the reality that is of two levels of being. First, of God as infinite, eternal, and unchangeable, and secondly, of the universe as derivative, finite, temporal, and changeable. A position is best known by its most basic differentiation, he suggests. The meanings of all words in the Christian theory of being depend upon the differentiation between the self-contained God and the created universe. And he was fond of representing it with a little diagram like this. So God is the bigger circle to suggest that he is more fundamental, more ultimate, greater than the universe. Connected to it, not utterly distinct from it, but of a different sort of being to the creation. And he contrasts this to a monistic type of universe where everything that exists in the same way. Now, notice this isn't a distinction between theism and atheism. You can still have gods in a monistic universe. It's just that the gods have got to exist in the same way that everything else exists. Okay, whatever there is exists in the same way. That's what monism is. If you want gods, great, you put them in there, but they exist in the same way that everything else exists. But the distinctive of Christianity is that God exists differently to how everything else exists. Everything else is reliant on him. He is reliant on nothing and no one. And this means that the Christian finds herself in an incredibly fruitful position to look upon the whole of reality and to make sense of it. And if you don't have this creator-creature distinction, it's harder, I think, to make sense of the world we live in. And if you don't have absolute personality theism, it's harder to make sense of the world we live in. So you've got this sense, on the one hand, this is your Aristotle over here, ultimate reality is absolute, and that's pretty good. That allows you to do a whole bunch of things. You've got a stable universe, you've got predictability, you've got order. That's pretty good. That's cool. That's better than the alternative, which is absolute chaos and nobody knows what's going on and there's no meaning. And you've got ultimate reality being personal over here, and that's pretty cool because you've got the personhood being dignified and the personal being meaningful in a way that's more than human, and that's sort of pretty cool as well. But the problem is that both in this dichotomy here and often in our society, we sort of almost subliminally pushed to choose one of these over the other. You know, are you the sort of science type who's all on the absolute side, or are you the artsy bohemian tie-dye type who's all on the personal side? And neither of those take full account of the reality in which we live. Like, science is really, really good. Like, we like that. And arts are really, really good, and we like those too. But I don't want to choose. Like, why would I choose a way of being that neglects half of this? That would be ridiculous. And absolute personality theism. And what this diagram is doing is it's just showing that it cuts across. You can't put it in one box. Like, it's not absolute personality theism goes here, or absolute personality theism goes here. It sort of doesn't fit in either of the boxes. That's what this idea is trying to get across. And I'm going to skip that one. For us, in an institution of higher education like this one, this is particularly good news. And particularly good news now, I think, in our culture, because I don't know how it is here. It might be wonderfully different, but the picture in higher education more broadly, and certainly in the institutions in my own country, is that there's a general incomprehension of what the arts and humanities are all about. That's just entertainment. Like, reading literature is what you do in your spare time if you're that sort of person. There's no fundamental benefit. There's no social benefit to doing that. It's peripheral and ephemeral. Now, go back far enough in history and you get the same for the sciences. Like, the queen of the philosophical disciplines, the university disciplines, is theology, and literature and poetry and so forth are really valued, and sciences for the dilettantish. It's what those who are that way inclined do so in their spare time in their little laboratories in their homes. And it's just switched. It goes back and forth over time, but neither of those positions are satisfactory for the Christian, because we don't want to diminish the orderliness of the universe, or, as you know, Cavendish, who founded the Cavendish Lab in Cambridge, has over the door of that institution. You know, we are searching the works of the Lord as we look at the wonderful creation that he's made and trying to find out how things work. We don't want to diminish that, but neither do we want to diminish the value of studying human beings. Because God is personal, therefore persons matter. Therefore literature which explores what it means to be a person and what human experience feels like and looks like, studying human beings as human beings, not simply as biological conglomerates, studying our experience as experience, equally matters. Because God is not just absolute, is he? He's personal. And therefore this absolute personality theism equally justifies and gives weight and dignity to the arts and the sciences. So a Christian institute of higher education should, and I can say this freely because I don't know how it is in this particular institution, so I'm not either saying that it's done well or badly here, I just don't know, so I can speak freely. It should value both of these equally. We study God's world because God is absolute and this is an ordered world and it makes sense and predictability works. You can predict things. in the world, so science works, and we study human beings, because God is personal, and human beings aren't just sort of some froth on the timeline of history, but there is a dignity and a worth and an importance to you and to me, and it's worth reading literature and trying to work out what human life and experience is all about in the same way that it's worth working out what the natural world is all about. Isn't that glorious as a Christian? We don't need to join in this fight. You know, early 21st century, it's sciences that's winning. Go back a few centuries, it's the arts that win. How foolish. No, both of these are worthy objects of pursuit because of who God is. And isn't it wonderful that it's the same God who justifies both of them? We don't have the justification of, you know, sciences over here, and then we've got to find somewhere other justification for the arts over here. It's the same God who justifies both of them. And as someone who works in an arts faculty, it's just lovely. I feel at peace as a Christian about that. I'm not at war with my scientific friends and colleagues. In fact, I'm cheering them on. And I'm fully settled in the idea that what I'm doing is meaningful in the big story, in the big picture of the universe as well, because of the God we serve. So again, the Bible, diagonalizes is just getting at this idea of it doesn't sit in either box snugly. It sits across them. It rearranges what's in the boxes, the sciences and the arts. Ultimate reality is relational. So, of course, God is not simply a person. God is one God in three persons. And so there is relationality baked into the foundation of reality. So it's not as if, first of all, there's one God, like there's the Father, and that's fine for a while, and then the Son and the Spirit come along a little bit later on. Like, relationality isn't an afterthought in the universe. And again, you know, I could go on for ages, and I'm probably thinking you're glad that I'm not going to, about the significance of that for our understanding of the universe. Like, relationships are not ephemeral or simply something that we might choose to have as part of our life. Like, relationships are fundamental in our universe because God is a relational God. And again, philosophically, there are huge implications to that in terms of, you know, problems of the one and the many and so forth, which I think is as a Christian, you say, we can't start from there. We start from the Trinity, which messes really quite interestingly with the idea of the one and the many in ways that I think it's philosophically really rich to bring out. Yeah, the one, the Trinity, and the many. So if you start with the one and the many, you've already loaded the dice against ever understanding what the Bible is saying. And understanding the subversiveness of the Bible for the way that we think about society. So Van Til again, the whole problem of knowledge has constantly been that of bringing the one and the many together. This is not just a little philosophical problem off to the side. The one and the many is not some sort of cute little footnote somewhere. Like, this is central problem of Western tradition over the millennia type, hit your head against a brick wall for centuries type problem. Like, this is key to the way that our tradition has understood the world. And I think that the Bible has something refreshingly and surprisingly different to offer to a lot of the way that these debates go round and round and round through the Trinity. David Bentley Hart, again, in the Beauty of the Infinite that I mentioned a moment ago, the truly unexpected implication of Trinitarian dogma is that Christian thought has no metaphysics of the one and the many. We don't start with the one and the many as Christians. The same and the different, because that is a polarity that has no place in the Christian narrative. And this comes back to your point, sir, of let the Bible start where it starts. Like, don't say, okay, the problem is the problem of the one and the many. Now, what does the Bible have to say about that problem? Because what the Bible has to say is don't start with the problem of the one and the many, because you're never going to understand what the Bible says if you lock yourself into that thinking and don't contemplate the possibility that that might not be the best place to start. So let the Bible be the Bible. This has lots of implications for the way we think about society that you might want to pick up on in the Q&A afterwards. That modern societies, I think, see themselves fundamentally as the one and the many. The one is the central state. The many is the isolated individual. I think we've got a very one-many view of society in modernity, and Christianity would challenge that, I think, in really profound ways and really healthy ways for all of us, I believe. And also, it sort of cuts across this tension that sometimes you find between more traditional societies that value the community, that my identity should not be individual. My role is to serve the family and to serve the community of which I'm part. And if I stick out from that, then I'm not being a very good human being. And of course, there's a tendency of the pathological versions of that to crush individuality and to leave people feeling trapped. But there's equally, on the side of more modern societies, an overemphasis on individuality. Like, don't let anyone tell you what to do. Don't let your family, don't let your society, don't let your culture, don't let your friends tell you what to do. You be your person. And that can lead to a fracture and a neglect of community. It can lead to the weakest in society being left out in the cold because nobody's willing to set aside their own agenda in order to help them. So the very young and the very old tend to suffer in those sort of societies. And so you don't want to say, is the Bible, traditional society, it's all about the community, or is the Bible modern society, it's all about the individual, because neither of those are big enough. It bursts the wineskins of both of those categories. And I think the Trinity gives us the beginning of a way to think beyond that dichotomy. It's not all about the individual, it's not all about the community, but there is both community and individuality related in really interesting ways. And of course, there's work to be done to bring that out of the immediate concept of the Trinity into human society. You can't just sort of transplant the Trinity into society, but there's nevertheless the beginnings of a line of thought there that allows you to think about society differently to how it's customarily thought of in the secular world in which we live. And finally, ultimate reality is love, because of course the relationships enjoyed between the persons of the Trinity are not just generic relationships in the Bible, aren't they? It doesn't say God the Father related to the Son before the creation of the world. If you stack up all the verses that talk about how the Father and the Son relate before the creation of the world, the overwhelming majority of them talk about that relationship using the language of love. So it seems that there is something particular about love that characterizes these intra-Trinitarian relationships, biblically speaking. And therefore, I think it's fair enough for us to say, and again, John is our license for doing this, God is love. So John is not simply saying God is loving, or there's a lot of love about God, but he uses that emphatic language, God is love. I think we're within our rights to say that ultimate reality is love. And of course, that's a game changer as well, because the way that our society primarily thinks about relationships, by and large, is fundamentally in terms of power. The baseline is always power. You've got little islands of love and you've got little islands of sacrifice. Of course we're nice to each other. We're not suggesting that we're some sort of brutes that are always bashing each other over the head and in utter competition with everyone else the whole time. But nevertheless, the baseline, the heartbeat of society and of relationships, and again, John Milbank shows how this works its way out philosophically in the opening chapters of Theology and Social Theory, is power. And love is the exception, love is the island in the ocean. Biblically speaking, how glorious is it that love is the baseline, love is the ultimate reality, and meanness and nastiness are islands of sin within that fundamental ocean of the baseline way of relating in the universe being love. Now, of course, in this post-lapsarian state, that's often very far from what we see, but nevertheless, ultimately, the most core relationships that exist are relationships of love, not relationships of power. And that predisposes us as Christians, I think, to engage with ourselves and society in profoundly different ways to if we thought that relationships are basically about power more than they're about everything else. And we've got to try and force ourselves away from that to get to love. Okay. This is what I've just described. Good. I've done. Phew.